Welcome to Cloud Context, where we actually love to talk about all things Microsoft Cloud, including Azure and 365, except for today. Today we are talking about all things AWS with Bojan Zivic. Bojan is a lead consultant in the AWS practice at a certain particular managed services provider, which he may or may not disclose a bit later. Obviously, I'm Microsoft native, so I know very little about AWS, but I do know the right questions to ask when we're talking about public cloud services. But before we get into it too much, I'll give you guys a bit of a background about how I know Bojan. So Bojan and I became reacquainted when he actually applied for a role at a previous managed services provider that we used to work at. So I was, I think, a senior engineer or something like that, senior infrastructure engineer, and Bojan applied for a role, and Bojan was successful in that role. And I think I played a bit of a part in the interview, if I remember correctly. Maybe. But basically, we already knew each other back from our university days. We didn't talk too much at university, but we were acquainted through friends and a few other people that we know. They went to university together, and then we became reacquainted again at a managed service provider. I sort of took the path of Microsoft Azure, and I moved on from that managed service provider, and Bojan took the path of AWS.
Team Blue, Team Orange.
Team Blue, Team Orange, that's it. And that pretty much will bring us to today, where we are both consultants in our respective fields, and we've made it up through the ranks, I guess, and we are now actually full-blown consultants compared to when we were doing engineer type stuff. So I'll let Bojan give you guys a bit of a background. Bojan, why don't you take us through your career, how you went from wherever you started to being a lead consultant?
Okay, no worries. Well, as any beginning kind of starts, I was actually at the very level, base level. I started off actually somewhere else away from IT. I actually worked at a vendor, Lenovo, and I wasn't actually doing IT at all. I was doing sales whilst at uni. However, I told myself I really need to get into IT. So I took the most base level entry job I could, which was I was working for a IT provider that helped out schools, private schools and public schools in the North Shore and the Hills area. Now the downside of that was it was base level, base entry, pay for your own petrol, just get there, get the job done and leave. And it wasn't really quite traditional IT. It was just help fix laptops and help replace screens. However, from that, I had a few friends from university who got me into help desk, and from the help desk I moved on to doing support engineering. From support engineering at a media company. So I went from an MSP space to the customer side. Look, I started off relatively base level. Whilst I was still at uni, I actually joined a school-to-school IT support, where basically I was on-site helping with laptops and doing some base level server stuff, but nothing really high level. From that, I moved on to a MSP, very small MSP, actually out of Western Sydney, that has grown, so congratulations to them. And from that, I went into support engineering, so more on the app side. From that, I actually continued on the customer side for a year, and then finally we met at our mutual managed service provider. Obviously, we went down different paths, but we both went down a path to cloud, both really hungry in both spaces. I think what really made us click was we both enjoyed PowerShell because, hey, yes. I don't want to click if I can just make my job a lot easier. It's like
automation.
Basically.
Speak about that a lot, guys.
Early DevOps.
That's it.
And from that, things just blew up. I went onto a cloud role where I was seconded doing a bit of DevOps work in Canberra for that managed service provider. And then from there, I moved on to two different cloud consultancies. One I stayed at for a couple of years and had a great time there. And then I finally had the opportunity to join where I am right now, CMD Solutions. So they're a AWS cloud consultancy. And when it comes to shirt swag, run CMD, I think they kind of speak for themselves.
That's awesome. Awesome shirt.
Yeah. No lawsuits, thankfully. So good.
So that shirt is from the company?
Yeah.
Oh, that's
They've really
awesome.
put a lot of time and effort into the swag side.
That's really clever.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Cool. So what are you doing at Run CMD, at CMD Solutions?
So I'm a lead consultant, but that could mean a lot of things, right? There, what I like is it's an approach of I'm both doing DevOps work as well as consulting work on the side of, for example, best practice, architectural work, early stages of, for example, discovery as well for new clients and such. And a lot of it basically in my space, because the practice that I'm part of is app modernization. And that is basically, in a nutshell, the technical concepts that kind of spawn from the culture that is DevOps, and then things like containerization, serverless, Kubernetes, all within the AWS space.
Cool.
Yeah.
And are you mainly working on new projects, things that come in, or you guys also do managed services?
We do have a managed services side of the consultancy, but I focus on the consulting side.
Yep.
So I'm purely on I think in a traditional world, it's like you would consider it professional services in a way, but it's really not because it's pure consulting.
Yep.
Because for example, at CMD, you'll have a mix of people who are great consultants in the sense of like they'll know how to engage with customers, but they'll be also very techie consultants as well.
Okay.
So it's
cool.
a very wide variety.
So you guys do both the consulting and actually the deployment of services, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
Cool.
But consulting, I think, in its traditional sense, isn't just about we're going to tell you what to do. We also get quite hands-on. Like one of my earlier projects, I was doing from the ground up an infrastructure as code deployment using AWS CDK. Big fan, by the way. And from the ground up, it was a greenfield project. And then current project that I'm on is more established. So we're just helping with continuous improvement, building out some new tooling for them, as well as engaging with, they basically have a Kubernetes setup. Yep. So things are revolving around that. Obviously, can't give away too many company secrets, but being involved in that process as well.
Cool. So can you talk to us about how you go from a customer calling you and saying that they have a problem and actually deploying the solution? Is that something that you take on as a whole?
I can give you an example of what we see on a day-to-day. So in my day-to-day is basically we follow a very agile method where it's 2-week sprint and such. And during that time period, you'll have refinement sessions and you'll have just general queries get brought up. Let's just say a problem statement will be brought forward. Typically work out whether it's, first of all, if it makes sense. A lot of the time you'll find that with customers, they have the right intention, but the right tooling might not be there. There's a term coined in our industry as the resume engineer that people need to be very cautious of. Just because it sounds like a good idea, just because it's the latest, the greatest, doesn't mean it should be the perfect thing for you.
Absolutely.
We can take that as, for example, people who pay the early adopter tax. You get in early, you get burnt early, you don't have the support you would as you would later on.
Yep.
So it's finding that right happy time. So they'll bring a problem to me, for example, with CI/CD, and it could be that, for example, instead of taking a traditional route, which would have been, let's just say, use the existing infrastructure. We'll call out a couple of tools here. I'm not going to say they're good, I'm not going to say they're bad, but I'll call them out either way. Let's just say they have everything currently on something like Jenkins. Let's just say they want to do something tooling-wise that's not possible in Jenkins. Unlikely, but let's just say we have another alternative, and they're actually contemplating moving away from one tool to another. Well, I can build a POC for them, and then from that they can go, okay, we want to integrate that, and from that we can do the planning stages, and from that I can go back to the sales team, I can go back to the principal, and we can actually architect something. Otherwise, if it's a small and meaningful change in an existing environment, let's just say it's in the Kubernetes space, where they're looking at using a service mesh, for example, and this is throwing a lot of jargon and this is throwing a lot of buzzwords.
That's okay.
But that's what Kubernetes is, and really DevOps is as well, right?
Yeah, that's right.
They might not know what they want to do. And let's just say they want to go, we're not too sure if we want to go Istio, Linkerd, or we want to try the AWS equivalent, App Mesh. So we can actually break it down. We can actually go back to the expertise we have internally. And we can go, okay, well, we've got experience in X, Y, and Z. We have, for example, a tool set or a set of best practices we can employ to help you out. And this is where both my build, so I will also go through and build in the infrastructure as code side. For example, in this case, if it's on Kubernetes, it'll be maybe a mix of, for the AWS side, building out the clusters using infrastructure as code, and on the Kubernetes side, using something like Helm to deploy particular components of, for example, as I mentioned, Istio, and then introducing practices for continuous use. So there's something called GitOps. It's been a con term last couple of years. It's kind of like continuous CI/CD pipelines and such, but it's kind of not, because it's kind of focused around the Kubernetes space.
Yep.
And it's just basically how can we do the wonderful things we do with pipelines and CI/CD inside of the Kubernetes space.
Okay.
So we've helped people by using things like Argo CD to introduce like canary deployments. If I bring out something new, I don't want my streaming service to go down just because I did a bad deploy. It'll deploy at a small period of time, it'll see if it works, and let's just say after 10 minutes, it'll then do a full deployment. Okay. It'll get like 10% of the traffic. Small little tests.
Awesome.
Yeah.
That's pretty cool. So are you doing that type of solution all the time, or you do more of the traditional stuff as well?
I'm more on that side. That's
Okay.
the app modernization practice.
Okay.
So heavily what I'm involved in is the serverless side, the container side, the Kubernetes side, but there's also traditional concepts. I think the part that people tend to forget with, let's just say with the word DevOps, It doesn't mean you abandon all your previous practices. If you don't have the networking knowledge, how will you be able to build a proper architecture?
That's right.
And especially with something like AWS, it can, and actually any cloud, you disappear from using something like Meraki's, or if you're using Palo Alto or anything like that, although those virtual appliances do exist, to using something like, let's just say, a transit gateway inside of AWS. Wonderful tool, by the way. It's codified, it's even better, so I don't have to click ops anything. I have a template, I update it, I point it to different places, I add a couple of attachments, and I connect multiple AWS accounts together that are necessary, with security in mind as well.
Yep.
And on that, I can build the best practices. So let's just say legacy information should always be, I wouldn't say adhered to, but it's a necessary thing to know.
Yes, absolutely. And Bojan, what did you do to get into this space? Have you done any sort of studying? Have you done any sort of lab work at home? How did you find yourself getting into AWS and becoming an SME?
So I'll give you a couple of points from working and the self-study. And I think the big thing, as much as you do in your own work, you want to try to find your own time to do at home as well, and truly find what you enjoy. And clearly something must be wrong with me, because I happen to love AWS. So I do have, from work, when I joined my second customer-facing company, I did a bit of AWS, and that kind of spawned my love of it. And from there, they had their own sandpit. I played with that. I built on that. I followed news that was coming out on Reddit. There's the AWS Reddit, there's the DevOps Reddit, and all these wonderful community places that are around these particular clouds. And I'm sure it's the same for Azure as well.
Absolutely.
So from that, I found little things to play with and build. A lot of the time at that point, my love for, as in my comment, surprise to you, the development side kind of came out.
Yep.
At university, I didn't really enjoy it. I found that it was a necessary evil. I had to do it, so it's the next unit to continue. But as I started working with it more, PowerShell, Python, Bash, doing a bit of Go, doing JavaScript, TypeScript, it helped improve what we're doing day to day, and I fell in love with it. So I started doing some home projects. I built a home lab. I didn't know what the hell Kubernetes was. So I first started with Docker. Then I made Kubernetes and made a little single node cluster using something called K3D, which is K3S. It's a Rancher product. It's a very, very trimmed down small version of Kubernetes, but you can run the whole Kubernetes multi-cluster inside of different Docker containers.
Cool.
If you're trying to do home labby sort of stuff and playing around with it and getting like 80 to 90% of what a proper cluster can do, it helps. But home labby stuff definitely, and I've done all 3 of the associate certifications.
Cool.
So I'm actually on my way now to the professional cert. Awesome. In about a month. That's going to be absolutely fun, 3.5 hours of my life. Can't wait for that. But yeah, a combination of work, but also self-study. And I think that's the key component, because if you do an hour a day, let's just say hour every couple of days, you're ahead of anyone else who's just trying to figure it out through work.
Yep, cool. And something that I talk about a lot is the fact that if you really want to lead in a certain field or a certain tech, you have to take it on outside of work.
Absolutely.
Right? Like you have to be that passionate about it that you're doing it on the weekends. You're
Absolutely.
doing it after hours. So aside from the fact that, you know, we say that you have to do all sorts of extracurricular stuff, so outside of work hours, on weekends, if you're really passionate about something, you just find yourself doing it anyway.
Yeah.
How important do you think your certifications were? And like, do you think that you could have got to where you are without those certifications?
When you go down a road, let's just say you're driving, you look at the signs that kind of point you to where you need to go, right? Or you follow your GPS, it'll tell you to go down this street, go down that street. You need to take the certification as being kind of that way. You're not doing a certification for the sake of a brain dump to prove to people you know something. Because there's a lot of ways to cheat a certification.
Absolutely.
You can go through and do a million practice tests over and over again, but what have you really learned? Well, this is where the right way to learn to the certification kind of comes through. So you can take mock tests, for example. There's a wonderful guy at Udemy. Sorry if I butcher your name. John Bonso is part of Tutorial Dojo.
Okay.
He'll give you mock exams from other people who have done the same exam. And he's got a company based around people just doing certifications. But when you finish the mock exam, if you've got something wrong or right, it'll give you an explainer on why it's wrong, what the best, most right answer is, not just a right answer is, and what led to that answer. So you're actually learning. There's Stefan Merik. He's a Kafka, AWS tutor online, again through Udemy, who'll guide you through learning and doing certain things. But I can't talk study-wise if I'm not mentioning probably one of the best in industry, Adrian Cantrell. initially from Linux Academy. He started now A Control. Fantastic deep dive as well as labs for you to do as well and work on.
Just AWS type stuff?
For Adrian Cantrell, yes. Stephen Merrick also does some Kafka stuff as well. So that's the messaging queues. And the tutorial dojo, as far as I'm aware, it's around AWS.
Cool.
Yeah.
All right, so we know a bit about your background, we know what you have been working on every day. Tell us about some of the cool little things that you have been working on. So something that is really taking a lot of your time or a lot of your interest lately, even if it doesn't have to be for a customer.
Okay. The one big thing that's really taken my interest has been CDK, which is the AWS Cloud Development Kit. Now, most of us, if you're in the cloud industry, probably knows a CloudFormation, either JSON or YAML to make basically a template that AWS will deploy over infrastructure. CDK is abstracting that, but with pure code. So I don't have to know really much AWS services or any JSON or YAML templating specific to anything AWS. I can use Python or TypeScript, JavaScript, if you're unfortunate enough, Java, C# or Go to actually build my infrastructure as code. And the best part is you won't be doing it on a notepad. You probably, hopefully, won't be doing it on Notepad++. You'll probably be using VS Code or another IDE that has some IntelliSense.
Yep.
So as I'm making my, for example, let's just say it's an ECS cluster. When I come to it, and I want to, for example, do something called a method call, right? If I go dot, I want to make a method call, and I can go add security group, add image, etc., and it really shrinks my infrastructure as code. So when you look at CloudFormation for a fully developed infrastructure, you typically separate everything out to like networking templates, application templates, and so on and so forth. You don't want to have it all clustered. But even though you have like networking template, app template, and a bunch of other stuff, let's just say, for example, CloudFront templates, you've got to read through 500 lines plus at a time of YAML or JSON, YAML being shorter, to kind of figure out what you're actually dealing with.
Yep.
That's a pain.
Absolutely.
CDK shrinks that. So perfect example is I created one for a customer where we created an SQS, which is a message queue, a Fargate ECS. You can call it serverless container. That's what Fargate really is. It's serverless containers inside of AWS, managed through ECS essentially, that will execute a task that one of the developers made, right?
Yep.
And it'll feed and execute from the SQS queue. As that queue rises, the Fargate task will be invoked. So it's basically like a consumer, more or less, right?
Yep.
4 lines of code. It
Amazing.
spits out 400 lines of CloudFormation. Even if I'm a new developer, if I've got something very obvious, SQS, Fargate, consumer, I kind of know what it does. Put in comments, obviously, for good practice, etc.
Yep.
And we created something called a custom construct. So it's basically, we did all the background work, and we put that to actually something like, so with Python, you have pip, which is a package repository with JavaScript and TypeScript. You have NPM, and AWS brought out a new, I think it's a collaboration, not just AWS, called constructs.dev, where I can publicly put my custom construct, which simplifies a bunch of stuff for me, right? And allow others to actually pull from it and use it as well. And basically from 8 to 10 lines of code, I could have 7,000, 8,000
awesome.
lines of CloudFormation. But it's not just on the cool and interesting stuff, as you'd say, maybe containers are to some, but even the networking side.
Yeah, absolutely.
Look, if I want to, for multiple subnets, for example, if I want to have a lot of endpoints on each one of them, right? I can do a for loop because it's code. So again, code goes from copy, paste to a for loop.
Amazing.
And it's sneaky because with CDK, you're teaching programming without actually teaching programming.
That's right.
So then, let's just say you move on to Azure. You decide that you're sick of orange, you want to go to blue. Azure Functions exist. So you can obviously execute Python and a bunch of JavaScript, and I'm sure a couple other runtimes, right?
Yep.
Well, now you know programming. You've learned from another cloud without instinctively knowing it. You can read it. And that kind of helps bring that path to a future engineer away from a traditional sysadmin because they were forced to do it a certain way to more in line of what people consider an SRE or a DevOps engineer to be.
Yep.
Yeah.
Amazing. That is very interesting, actually.
Yeah.
I might have a look at that myself.
Well, you'll be surprised that it doesn't stop at just at AWS. They brought out something called CDK TFS, which is CDK Terraform. So you codify Terraform as code. So that means you can execute, Azure, whatever you'd like, using CDK TFS.
Yep.
So you don't have to know Terraform, but you can just know, for example, TypeScript.
Cool.
It's still in the early stages because it hasn't got much community uplift that CDK has, for example.
Yep.
But it works. You can create your own Terraform, not specifically modules, your own Terraform work to apply for pretty much any other provider that Terraform can work on.
Cool.
So even VMware.
Actually, one of my next questions was, where do you think cloud computing is going? Have you sort of answered that question?
I don't see. What I spoke about was the templating behind cloud computing, but where it's really going is you really got to look at who the biggest players are. It's not just AWS, it's not just Azure, it's also Akamai. It's also who purchased Linode recently. That's a
big acquisition.
That's a big acquisition. There's a good reason behind that too. You look at what Cloudflare did with releasing their edge compute. As for example, it's not just wireless. As our capacity to receive at the local level better, quicker, more powerful internet kind of expands, compute at the edge becomes much more important.
Absolutely.
So the future state of the cloud, I think, really is a combination of containers and serverless in the sense of what each one provides, because essentially with serverless applications, you're running specific tasks on top of what is essentially either a micro VM or a container on the edge. If you look at, we won't talk about Apple, but Apple's done some amazing things with ARM. But look at what AWS has done with Graviton. It uses the thermal output, I think 40% of what Intel and AMD use, to give you about 30 to 40 cores to scaling up to, I'm not 100% quotable here, but about up to a couple of hundred cores at a time if need be.
Yep.
For certain workloads, it's fantastic. You don't need a heavy compute workload if you're just going to be hitting for example, a MySQL endpoint.
That's right, yeah.
Yeah. So you don't need that. But the best part is you've managed to fit 200 plus cores in 2 IU. If you think back in a day when you and I were both working in the data center, to fit that much compute into 2 IU, let alone 1, because in 1 IU you can have 128 cores.
Yep.
With that 1.5 terabytes of RAM.
Amazing.
Yeah. Now, condense that down into a box that big and start putting it at edge locations everywhere. And what do you get?
Amazing.
Well, AWS has already done that. It's so AWS is a concept where they've started with regions, right? So you've got Sydney, you've got Singapore.
Yep.
So they've gone even closer. In due time, we'll actually have local zones. They're already available in certain parts of America. I believe California is one of them, where it brings the compute even closer to the company and the consumer.
Cool.
And a Sydney local zone will actually be coming out, as well as I believe a Perth local zone as well.
Cool.
So if I'm a customer and I need to go, I need the best and most performant compute possible, closest possible to my customers, well, I can use my Perth local zone.
Yep.
Obviously, compute will be restricted.
And where are they physically housed?
So obviously, with anything that AWS does, not everything is purely non-company secrets. There's obviously NDAs wrapped around that as well.
Yep.
Conceptually, you can imagine that data centers can be pretty much anywhere with sufficient enough cooling.
Yep.
And once you reduce that thermal input, it could also mean that thermally you don't need as much to keep that cool. So in theory, you could pretty much have it anywhere as long as it meets certain criteria. Australia obviously being an issue because 48 degrees will fry quite a lot.
Yeah, absolutely.
But they'll typically be in data centers for the time being. I would really suggest, as with anything in IT, if you don't know it, I probably have to Google a little bit more to give you more of a concrete answer.
Google experts.
Absolutely, right. And they'll probably have it at the edge, whether that be a micro data center of sorts or whether that be attached to a phone tower, I'm not sure.
Great.
But we're getting there.
Great.
Yeah.
It's good. It's very exciting stuff coming out of AWS
definitely.
all the time.
Yeah.
Yeah. And for the viewers, if they are looking to get into AWS and they're watching my channel for some reason, how would you suggest that they get into it? So let's say someone who's in an IT role hasn't touched anything cloud.
Sure.
What would you suggest they do to get into the AWS space?
Okay, well, AWS gives you a year free of certain compute. So for starters, know exactly what you can use in that year for free. You can't obviously use the biggest and greatest 192 core, 3.5 terabyte instances. But for example, T2 micros are free. So you can learn how to spin that up. You can actually spend some time breaking and costing yourself $20 to $15 at a time, right?
Yeah.
That's the basis. One of the ones might actually be trying to attempt a certification. But before you get to the certification level, finding the right study material. So if you're an engineer who has, for example, a lot of infrastructure experience, and say, for example, infrastructure experience comes from the Windows realm, doesn't mean you have to go to Azure. Same thing applies with Linux. It doesn't mean
Absolutely.
it doesn't mean you have to go to
Absolutely.
AWS, right? You should, but still. You can take that skill set and basically find the cloud equivalents. I know networking. Look up what a VPC is. I know I've typically had NAT through something like a firewall. Look up what a NAT gateway is, or how you can build your NAT instances.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then find like services and play with them. You can do as much as you want in theory, but it's not practice. So you really want to take that route. If you really want to be on the safest route, and you really don't want to spend an accidental $400, because that can happen.
Absolutely, I've done it.
It's happened to me. I forgot I'm running a database that's snapshotting every hour.
Been there as well.
A Cloud Guru is pretty great. They give you labs. They have their own AWS accounts that they spin up for you. Full access as well.
Excellent.
You can spin up any other server that you want. They host their stuff in AWS as well. And they'll give you great pathways. And with stuff like A Cloud Guru, and again, not affiliated, CMD affiliated, you can learn Linux, you can learn Windows, you can learn AppSide too. And I think it's just because what you know now will not be what you know in a couple of years' time, as long as you put in your own effort.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think that's very sound advice. That's usually generally what I suggest as well. Just get into it.
Absolutely.
Just do it.
Yeah.
Learn it, absorb it, let it become your second nature.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And find what you like.
Find what you like.
Yeah.
That's what it's really about.
Absolutely.
I like infrastructure. I like a bit of code, but not too much, not as much as you. You know, we've both taken our own sort of paths.
Absolutely.
We both ended up in decent places, I reckon.
Yeah, I'd say so.
Yeah.
And I think the best part is that in our industry, and especially in the cloud industry, if you chose to alter that and you want to go down I want to do more container stuff, you can.
You can, absolutely.
Yeah.
Even I find that, like, I don't do too much Python, right? I muck around with Python. I don't do it for work.
Sure.
But I think a lot of my experience with C++ at uni and JavaScript and mucking around, well, not mucking around, I mean really utilizing PowerShell.
Yeah.
I find that the concepts are easier to grasp. Once you understand like one or two languages, you sort of start to get the gist for basic stuff, right?
That's syntax, and that's probably the most important
syntax,
thing.
Right? Yeah.
Now, for example, your viewers and listeners, they may just know PowerShell.
Yeah.
That's a fantastic start.
It's
What is
fantastic.
it based on?
Yeah.
It's .NET.
Exactly.
Right? So if you know how to loop, for example, in one language, although that may change in another, for example, with Python, when you're importing modules,
Yep.
From this module, import this.
Yep.
With JavaScript, it's flipped the other way around.
Yeah.
Import this from here, right?
Absolutely.
But
It just takes adjustment.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And the best part is you'll start to learn, you'll start to read. And for example, it's like if you know a language that comes from the Romance family, right? If you're learning Italian, maybe it's easier for you to learn Spanish than it would be for you to learn Bosnian.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's right. It's a very good example, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, final question for the day, Bojan. Where do you want to be in 5 years?
See, 5 years is a big thing because I think myself 5 years ago, that was the early start to the cloud, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, you can comfortably say
You
that.
do a lot in 5 years.
And in our industry, and a lot can happen in 5 years too.
Absolutely.
Well, if you think about where, for example, compute has come in 5 years, right? We went from something that's almost as efficient as our phones to have 40 cores and 80 threads.
Yeah, absolutely.
And back then,
It's wild.
that's a full infrastructure for a small SMB, basically,
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
I think I'll definitely be still continuing part of the community.
Yeah.
I think that community engagement will continue.
Great.
Speaking more, evangelizing the AWS side. I can't help it. Look, people can have their opinions about all the different clouds and such, and obviously the expenses and some of the things you can do, can't do right. But I love what is happening and what you can do right with the right tooling. So I think like if I can be an advocate for those sort of right ways of thinking and doing,
Great.
I think that's the best place to see myself in 5 years' time,
I love
continuing that journey.
I love it. Awesome. And for those who don't know, I just learned that Bojan has a YouTube channel. So if you want to name drop it, Bojan, go for it.
Absolutely. So very shortly, the Infra Coder, that's me, will be coming to YouTube. I'll be doing things around AWS, CDK, serverless, container sort of stuff, but really looking at everything and anything you can do with infrastructure as code. So yeah, appreciate it.
So maybe in the near future, you can jump on and follow Bojan. Maybe by the time I post this video, he'll be available. So
Who knows? We'll see.
cool. Thanks, Bojan. Thanks for joining me.
Appreciate it.
Let's go get something to eat.
Absolutely. Let's go.